Please define the 3 different types of international schools according to Thompson and Hayden you agreed to work with, and please feel free to add examples due to your own work experience.
So type A international schools are traditional international schools that generally focus on serving global expatriate families, and they are the type of international schools that I have experience with.
Type B international schools are called ideological international schools. They are considered as a hub for students from different backgrounds and different cultures to come together and just share experience and promote for a global peace.
And Type C International School, it's basically refers to the schools who are faced to the local students mainly, and they introduce the international curriculum, so that's why they're calling themselves international school. So their main purpose is to send the local students abroad to the top universities worldwide, and by using their international curriculum results.
During your work together, you agreed on 3 central questions. Before we go into them individually, please name them briefly.
Yes, so we discussed the fact that international schools are microcosms of society, and so one of the questions we want to discuss and explore is how some of the international schools create gaps within the structures and the systems.
We also believe that international schools should ensure diversity within them. So our second question is, how can international schools effectively integrate diversity and also ensure inclusion?
Yeah. And the third question, as students are agents for change, especially in the globalization times, and we have so many social problems we're facing, and including the inequality things. So we're now thinking about how can international school empower students to foster diversity, equality, and inclusion.
Okay, back to your first question. What are some gaps that exist within international schools? Please describe your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the origin of international schools really began in Switzerland, Geneva, with the first international school being the Ecolent International School of Geneva. And it really was there to create a space for students and families who were transient and moving around the world, and offer them an English education so that they could then reintegrate back into whichever country that they came from. Predominantly, at the time, it was Western countries such as the US, the UK, Australia, Canada. It's definitely changed a little bit more since then, and so there are a lot more international schools that also are specific to like German language speakers, or French language speakers, or Spanish language speakers. But in doing so, having such a specific school that offers education to these expatriate families who transfer, they're often the ones who are diplomatic or missionaries or military families, or who have businesses who have local foreign offices around the world, and they have to move. And as a result, there's often quite a gap with the class, the economic status of the families, the social class of the families, the culture of the families, which really creates a divide between the local host nation and the families that attend these international schools. This is predominantly my experience with traditional international schools, and I think one of the perks that people see or parents see when they choose these schools is that they offer the International Baccalaureate, which is a very well-known curriculum framework that many international schools adopt so that they can transfer between countries very easily. Other curriculums such as American Common Core or the UK-based curriculum or the German curriculum, it's very much based on trying to make sure that those families who go to those schools are able to slot back into their host country or to their local country when they go back.
In type B international schools, the ideological international schools, such as the Peace School, where I'm coming from, where we just want to promote peace, global peace, we address gaps in another way. So for example, for socioeconomic status, we understand that some families struggle with socioeconomic matters. So we offer our parents that if they're not able to pay the full tuition in a year, we ask them to contribute in any way they can, maybe volunteer for us for our library operations, or just field trips, or pick up and dropping off hours, they can just contribute to that. And whenever they were able to pay the tuition, they can pay the tuition.
So in Type C international school, because they are faced to the local students, so the culture gaps and differences there are not very obvious, but there are some structural cultural incoherence exist there. For example, because the schools introduce the international curriculum, like for example IB, A-level, and AP, all of them are from the other culture backgrounds. And then the students and teachers are mainly from local context. So when they're trying to use the curriculum in their context, and there is incoherent. So basically speaking, in the especially Asia context, it's more traditional and teacher-centered teaching. And but at the same time, the curriculum somehow is from the Western constructivist assumption. So there is a struggle there, like to adapt to the curriculum and to the Western dominant discourse of education. As for the economic and culture gaps, I think the main problem is that because we did a research on 10 non-traditional international schools in a city, and it's obvious to say that all of them are from the upper middle family backgrounds. So somehow like it excludes the other class groups from the society. So because of the high tuition fee, like it's one of the main condition if you want to get into this kind of non-traditional Type C international school. But afterwards, they will get better access to the top universities worldwide by using their curriculum results. So actually these parents from the upper class, they are using their economic capital to accumulate students' culture capital in a way. So it's kind of like a capital exchange there. I think the gap becomes more obvious recently regarding to the globalization and the marketization of education. So I think maybe in the next question we can discuss a little bit about how this kind of gaps and could be reduced and bring more diversity and inclusion in our international school.
Yeah, and before we move on, I just wanted to say that Type A traditional schools also adopt this or have this the same types of gaps because the fees for these schools are very high. And even though they are mostly for expatriate families that are transient and moving around, those are the ones that are able to access that curriculum. And the very fact that they've chosen that curriculum as opposed to a local curriculum means that they're widening the gap as well with foreigners coming into a country and then saying, we don't accept or we don't want to integrate into this culture. We want something that is going to be accessible to us and us alone. So it really widens that cultural gap as well. And international schools were sort of founded, the purpose of them was to bring diverse families together and look at human rights and make sure that we're internationally minded global citizens, we're able to accept everyone and talk about differences at the same time, then trying to separate themselves from the local host nation. So there are a lot of gaps as well that really are are rooted in colonialism and white supremacy as well.
Well, I guess the culture gap, it's not the main gap in Type B international schools, because the main purpose of these international schools to bring different backgrounds and cultures to just exchange and share some experiences and make common experiences. So yeah, it's I don't think if that's actually the main concern in Type B international schools.
Yeah, so I feel it's interesting to notice there are different contexts and discourse within different situations, and I think among like non-traditional and traditional international school, there are more common shared gaps in the school among the students. So I think it's why we are represent different kinds of schools and to discuss here like what we could do in each of the situation.
Thank you so much. Your second question is, how can international schools effectively integrate diversity and foster inclusion? Please explain the association you had when you discussed the question.
So we understand that there are different aspects to ensure diversity, but as a group, we decided to only focus on 3 aspects: teachers, families, and students, teachers and staff, and students. So at the Peace School, we have an idea and a methodology we call the triangle, where the students are on the top and the staff, teachers, and families are at the bottom. So we believe that all 3 of these groups need to be involved in decision-making and educational programming planning, because we believe that if the responsibility of decision-making relies on only one group, it could be dangerous for the student and also for us as teachers. So we try to ensure diversity in a different sense, but by just maintaining the triangle and the collaboration among the 3 groups. But at the same time, we also try to have diversity among our teachers and staff. So for example, we had a deaf and blind teacher to just teach our students Braille and sign language, so our students could actually experience the real life and the real experience from themselves.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. In my experience at an international school, it's very much that the diversity should be diverse. International schools should be diverse in traditional ones, because they're focusing on many different families from all over the world, and yet it's often that a dominant identity or dominant culture becomes the identity of the school, whether that is, British or United States or Australian. It's sometimes in the name of the school. Sometimes it's not in the name, and it's like an unconscious decision that the school has made, or even a conscious decision in some cases. And so while there might be students from all over the world, diverse racially, ethnically, the gender is diverse, there's so many neurodiverse students that come to our schools as well, religious diversity as well. Often it's very Anglo and Christian. And so I think the challenge is trying to overcome this by hiring staff who are more diverse, so that students from specific countries can see themselves in those staff members and see the possibilities, because so often our leaders in these international schools are white British men, white American men, even though the statistical data shows that education is very much a female-dominated industry. And often then we have at the very bottom of the sort of like hierarchy, our janitors, our like custodial staff tend to be local staff, whether that is from, people of color who then end up being in those roles. And then students see those dynamics and those social dynamics within international schools. And so I think it's really important when we're like recruiting staff members to be a little bit more diverse. I think it's great at the Peace School, like at an ideologically based international school, that is the focus, and it really isn't performative. It's very much like the soul of the school. Because I think on the outside, traditional international schools are very much like, okay, we're internationally minded, we're global citizens, we're diverse in brochures and videos, but in reality, it tells a very different story.
Yeah. I must say that the logic and the ideology behind the TAPSE International School is very different. So actually it's based on the needs. So it's needs oriented to, there is a need and there is a solution. So the market exists there. But I mean, there are some still like a space for negotiation and autonomy for teachers to do something in the curriculum, even though their main purpose is to achieve some like future educational development for students. But for example, like I noticed some of the TAPSE international schools, they have really better practice in their daily teaching. They have the students from different country and cultural backgrounds. So I think they brings just the diversity in the classroom. So if they have the different kinds of mindset and different point of view and just have the diverse of perspectives when it comes to this, probably historical or sociological, whatever, like they can just bring this diversity to students. At the same time, the school are also trying to, the good practice school, they're trying to bring some other elements rather than only test-oriented. So for example, they have the students lead clubs or societies. They have different kinds of activities to foster their diversity of education. Like they will focus on lots of different kinds of problems and the topics which are not mentioned in the curriculum or textbooks. So in this way, during the, in a way, like they just have this diversity themselves on the exploring of the world. Like they can search online, they can do some research themselves, and so they can say, okay, the world is not just like what mentioned on the textbook, and maybe there are more things valuable to discuss about beyond the like our goal of to go into the better university. So I think this is all two perspectives from teachers and schools. But I think if we want to drive the gap of the sociocultural gaps there, it's more difficult actually, because the tuition fee and also later on, if you want to go into the abroad university, it's very highly charged. I think in this way, maybe government and country can do something to say, okay, this kind of school could also be non-profit oriented, could also provide more scholarships for the students from lower class, so they can have access to this kind of school as well. Yeah.
In some sense, the life-related exploration also creates its own educational opportunities. So, for example, we don't have any religious curriculum, religious lesson plans in our curriculum, but if a student has a question about a religion, for example, we create a educational opportunity, for a learning opportunity for them. Also about diversity and how we can ensure inclusivity and diversity. Assessment is also another main topic that I believe, like, working in this school is very important, because we don't have any sort of assessment. We don't have a quantitative way of assessing our students. We don't have gradings. So it's more like it depends on the students themselves to see where they are lacking, where as teachers or as parents we need to help them to improve better. It's more like a evaluation and qualitative assessment. But it's a main concern in international schools, I think especially in traditional and non-traditional international schools, where assessment and grading is the main focus to later on when they want to enter top universities or other educational settings.
Yeah, it's really a challenge. I think in primary schools, using the International Baccalaureate, it's less focused on a number grade. But that jump from primary school or elementary school to secondary school becomes so quick and so big. The gap becomes so big because students who enter into secondary school receive a number grade, a quantitative grade, and they don't really care about the qualitative data. We provide it as teachers, but ultimately it's parents that drive that desire. It's universities that drive that force as well, because in order for many universities to accept these students, they want to see a number. And so it's a real tension between educators knowing what they should be doing and what is best practice, but the pressures of parents wanting that number grade and knowing how well their student is doing that way in order to enter into universities. Especially those elite universities, which often families choose these international schools for a reason.
Yeah, I think there is a bigger background there, like the reality, the social reality is there, and then the parents and the schools somehow adapt themselves to this kind of reality, and then so students somehow accept this, like not actively but positively, like they don't have other choice in this way. But I think as what Baron said, maybe there is a kind of way of education in international schools that could bring us, like non-traditional and traditional international schools, some of also the normal education school, like some reimagination of how we can do this instead of just focus on the future. Maybe it's good for the future. I really problematic this kind of good future ideology. I think there are some more valuable things. Maybe we can come to the third question. That is, students are agents for the change. So they are agents for themselves and they are agents for the whole society and also the future challenges. They are the agents of themselves. So there is no outside expectations should exist in this case to say if you have the higher mathematics scores and you can solve maybe the future challenge like climate challenge better, it doesn't really make sense. So in this case, how can international school empower students? Like from my perspective, like the TAPSE international school, it's unfortunately to say, like there are some performative things, like, okay, the global citizenship, what we discussed, it's important for the children, but in TAPSE International School, they emphasize that like in a performative way. So they say, okay, this is what we are going to bring in our daily education practices. But indeed, in their true teaching activities, this is not emphasized at all because the main purpose is totally another direction. So they kind of ignore this in a way because teachers also have their accountability and their assessment stress. So they should put their energy is like kind of limited, so somehow they put the focus of their work on that way. But I think if we talk about the students or agents, we somehow, especially in my context, like in Chinese context, somehow the teacher-centered education or teaching should go to another direction, which is student-focused, because if they feel they are more empowered by themselves, like they can solve the problem themselves, they can like lead a group study, other group study, a study group, or like a student club, whatever, if they can lead themselves and they can find the solutions for this and that, and then they can explore a little bit themselves, rather than to say, okay, the goal is there and we should be efficient, we should deliver the knowledge very efficiently by the teacher, and the teacher is the authority there. Instead of this, maybe students could read more on these teaching activities, even though they're still maybe focused on the test score in some way because it's not avoidable. So, but we can do it maybe a little bit alternatively, like choose another way, and to also to important during the teacher training, let them notice that there is another way, and you can maybe still have a good result in this way, and just bring them in the practice so student can somehow foster and be empowered. Yeah.
Yeah, in type B ideological international schools, like the Peace School, we don't believe that peace is only the absence of war, and it requires some values or practices that the student needs to have in early childhood, like empathy, responsibility, love, or compassion to others, so they can develop that core of peace, and when they enter society, they could actually spread that peace. So we believe that maybe empowering students with these values of peace can help them to provide a global peace and an inclusive environment for everyone. But at the same time, we also believe that it's also important to educate our teachers and families about that, because it doesn't matter if the student knows that, but their teacher don't or their family don't. So going back to the triangle again, it's like an ecosystem in some ways. So we do actually do teachers training and also family training.
Yeah, I think just touching on that, that's so important, that aspect of the relationship between students, staff, and parents, because when teachers bring specific curriculum into the classroom and they choose specific texts or they choose specific films or content to teach that mirrors their own experiences, it comes back to that diversity aspect. If we have diverse staff members who are able to create windows and mirrors and sliding doors to be able to have students see themselves reflected in the content and the projects that they choose, I think that then offers them the opportunity to be those agents for change and to really experience the world as they see it rather than as through the eyes of the teacher. And then they're able to have those conversations and connect at home as well with their own culture and their own family and their background, and maybe even connect with their grandparents or other family members, depending on the context and the situation. It's really empowering. I think many international schools have this ideology of, being global citizens and being environmental activists and racial justice and social justice warriors in so many different ways, and they just are lacking the next steps forward to go beyond being savioristic and performative and really diving deep into those difficult conversations. It does require both a grassroots approach from the bottom up and the top-down sort of hierarchical changes as well, systems changes.
Okay. So in your opinion, what other aspects could be reflected on?
So when we were talking in our group, we were thinking that every aspect that we're talking about international schools, about how we can effectively foster equity and inclusion, it shouldn't only be limited to international schools, and it should be spread to every other school, either private or public, the mainstream schools. So but we also want to say that these are based on our experience, and this is our solutions and alternative. It doesn't mean that it is the solution or alternative. Would you like to add anything else?
I think just as Baron said, like the international school, why it calls international school is kind of tricky here. Like if we emphasize the item of international and then it just create the bubble themselves to exclude the national or local culture outside. So I think in this way, not only think about how the international system could be improved, we can think in another ideology is that we trying to say every culture and every nation, every sounds or idea does matter. Like we're trying to bring all of them in the education rather than to say this is something very crucial for international school. Yeah, but as this kind of school exists, so we're discussing here how we can do better things in these items and categories. So yeah.
Yeah, I think because everywhere in the world is becoming globalized, local schools, public schools are already diverse, and we, I think, can learn from them and they can learn from us in many different ways.
Okay, so the group of international schools, we were talking about diversity as a core of international schools, and we were covering the aspect of grades and assessment. So you, as kind of an expert, we want to ask you some questions. Thank you for that. So what kind of impact can assessments have on different levels of diversity?
One of the things we know for sure is that different groups in society have different levels of attainment and standardised assessments. So in England, for example, we know that what racial group you belong to corresponds with how well you'll do in your exams. There's also a long history, particularly in the UK, of debate about the precise role that gender plays in assessments. And of course, for many years, some children were entirely shut out of taking exams because they were considered to be too disabled to benefit from that kind of education. So what social group you belong to has a massive impact. What social group you belong to can also have an impact on what you can access. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Scottish context because it's the one I'm most familiar with. And so in Scotland, not all schools offer the same subjects to study, and not all schools offer the same levels. So our highest level of exam is called the Advanced Higher. Not all schools offer Advanced Highers. Some schools will offer Advanced Highers, but only in a few subjects. And some schools, in fact, I might even argue many schools, will carefully select which pupils are able to take these exams and eventually sit these assessments and which are not. So during the course of my PhD, I interviewed quite a lot of Scottish young people from areas of high deprivation. And most of them complained that they couldn't access Advanced Higher qualifications. Some of them talked about having begun Advanced Higher qualifications and then withdrawn from them on the advice of their teachers. So who you are has a huge impact on what kind of exams you can even get to sit, never mind how well you do in them. Now, I'm also going to just quickly mention a different kind of assessment. And I'm thinking in this case about assessment for special educational needs. So something like being assessed to see if you have dyslexia, for example. There was a really interesting study done recently in Sweden in 2020, looking at an elite school, where they found that young people were able to easily access a diagnosis of dyslexia, which then gave them access to certain advantages when they were sitting their exams, which was then bolstering their attainment so that they could go on and access elite higher education institutions. There is some evidence that that might not just be a Swedish phenomenon, that that might actually be quite common globally, that we use who gets access to a label that has power, such as dyslexia, which can change what you're able to access in terms of resources, and that can be easier for some groups within society than others. Another case, and this is an American case, so it's not within the European Union, but it is, I think, interesting, is looking at labels of giftedness. And we know really beyond a shadow of a doubt that if you are Black, if you are poor, if you are female, you are less likely to be diagnosed as gifted. We know that if you have another learning difference, autism, dyslexia, that you are less likely to be noticed as gifted. We are fairly sure that if you're physically handicapped, you have a you're less likely to be noticed as gifted. So it seems that just like with access to assessments, access to labels is changed and moderated by who you are in society. Finally, how assessment data gets used can differ depending on who you are. So if you imagine we have the doctor's son and we have the son of the man who collects the rubbish, and they both do badly in the maths test, there is a possibility that how that is interpreted by teachers may be different. So the son of the man who collects the bins, oh, well, you were never very good at maths anyway, so don't worry about it, let's find you something else to do. Whereas the doctor's son might be offered more in terms of support because it is assumed that because of his family's social position that he ought to do better in assessments, and therefore support could be put in place to help him do better in assessments. And although I'm not aware of any really rigorous large-scale studies that prove that, I think it's an idea that's worthwhile keeping in the back of our minds. Do we respond to assessment data differently depending on which kind of labels are attached to it?
Okay, thank you. So in the context of international school, it's likely that from time to time universities do not accept grades from international schools. So what if we turn more into qualitative assessment? Just imagine that. So what kind of adjustments does our society need in order to be able to accept that kind of assessment? What do you think?
There has been an interesting experiment going on in Scotland recently where we were worried that we had a big difference between the attainment of the least and the most affluent. So if you were from a well-off area and a well-off family, you got good exam results. If you were from a poorer area and a poorer family, you probably got less good exam results. And so Scotland threw a huge amount of energy and money into what we called closing the attainment gap. One of the tools that was suggested and was being used in order to try to close that attainment gap was teacher judgment. The notion was that if you ask teachers what they think of their pupils, they know their pupils really well, they'll be able to give you a much more authentic assessment of that pupil than if you get them to sit an exam. I am hugely sceptical of that suggestion. I am not someone who believes in educational panaceas. I don't think there's ever going to be a magic wand or a silver bullet that solves all our problems. And I worried that teacher judgment sounded a little bit like a silver bullet. So I went and had a little look around and I found a couple of really interesting studies, one done in Switzerland, where teachers were presented with pieces of work that were said to have been written by different kinds of children, and teachers were asked to assess them. Teachers almost uniformly assessed the work of middle-class affluent children as being better than the work of poorer children. So there's a chance that if we turn to teacher judgment, we're going to be dealing with teacher bias and we're going to be reproducing the same old structural inequalities as were the problem when we were assessing them with exams. And again, looking at the gifted literature, there's a fairly clear strand that suggests that teacher judgment is terrible at recognising non-standard, so non-white, non-male gifted children. So my worry is that if we hope teacher judgment alone is going to fix assessment, I think that it may not quite work out the way we're wanting it to.
Okay. So what is the future of assessment with a more inclusive view?
I clearly don't think that either qualitative or quantitative assessment is immune to systemic bias. I think that both have significant issues that as educators we are all aware of, that we should be aware of in our practice and also aware of on a more sort of systemic level. I think that one of the main important things that we can do to reduce the role of teacher bias in assessment is to reduce social inequality. Bernstein, very many years ago, Basil Bernstein suggested education cannot fix society. And I think that if we genuinely want more equitable education, we need to look at what's the gap between the richest and poorest in society, and what are we doing about that, and how are we talking about that? Are we in a society where poor people are blamed for being poor? Are we in a society where we praise the most affluent and we think how wonderful they are? I also think that given that we know that there's bias, given that we know that we all have bias, we need to look at opportunities in assessment for young people to surprise us. There is often the case where a most unpromising looking young person will produce a piece of work and you look at it and you think, wow, I didn't know you could do that. And I think that our assessment needs to create opportunities for young people to do more and to do better and to be challenged in their assessment. I think that we need to approach assessment with the knowledge that some people are always going to do a little bit better because of who they are and where they're from. And therefore, when we're deciding, well, who gets to sit the advanced higher maths, keep that in mind. Is this somebody who maybe could surprise me when they were given the opportunity to do so? So I don't think there's a quick fix for assessment in schools. I do think that a deep understanding of the sociology of education can help us to make wise choices when we're actually practicing as educators.
Thank you so much. So we have to be, as teachers, we have to be creative as well.
I think we have to be creative, I think we have to be thoughtful, and I think we have to be political.